This is the Three Things with your host, Gene Church. Perhaps yesterday you had an opportunity to catch the episode and you had an opportunity to hear a child's voice in the background. Well, why did that happen? It happened because I was resorting to child labor in our program. My producer is my 12-year-old son, John Kevin, and my water provider is my 7-year-old son, Colin. Gentlemen, could you step over in front of the camera and at least say hi to the audience?
Hi.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. And now for our topic this evening. Throughout the last 4 years, we've heard the term constitutional crisis tossed around to the point that the term has almost lost all meaning. So, are we in one now with the current Supreme Court nomination, or is this just simply hype? I suppose the best place to start out is to address what is a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis is a problem or conflict in the function of the government that the Constitution is perceived to be unable to resolve. In the last 4 years, the whiners of the Democratic Party and their media propaganda arm have yelled constitutional crisis virtually every week. So there certainly has been a perception of a crisis, at least on the part of the Democrats and their allies. By that definition, if a party wants complete control under the government and the other party refuses to grant what they want, then there's a conflict, and that individual will always be able to claim that there's a crisis. But in reality, nothing that has occurred during the Trump administration is something that cannot be resolved through the process. Certainly, there have been disputes between the three branches of government, but given that our system is premised upon a balance of power, there is an understanding that the constitutional methods exist to address those disputes. While I joke that I didn't listen to my mother in my naming of the Three Things program, I'm often reminded of a description that she gave describing human relationships. She said that each person is in a lane in their life, like on a track. And as you run, you may ease into another person's lane, and there will be problems with that until the other person pushes back and the problems begin to get resolved between the two of them. And that's what we often see in what is referred to as a constitutional crisis. Over the last century, the development of an administrative state has turned more and more power to the executive branch. The legislative branch voluntarily gave up authority to regulate issues with health, education, urban development, agriculture, finances, and homeland security. They're all regulated by agencies without the necessity of Congress taking any action. From time to time, this authority is granted to the executive branch, and its administrative agencies come into conflict with the desires of members of Congress, and problems occur. However, while Congress has the ability to reassert control over these regulations, they rarely have done so. So what about the current situation with the Supreme Court? With the death last Friday of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and President Trump's stated intention to name a replacement next Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern, is there a crisis? After all, the Constitution gives the president authority to nominate a replacement and the Senate to advise and consent as to nomination. And it appears as of today that there may be a sufficient number of individuals who could likely vote yes. Ironically, while the appointment itself in an election year is handled the way they usually are when one party controls both the presidency and the Senate, the hypocrisy of both sides is evident in that Republicans spoke 4 years ago about waiting and now want to vote now, and Democrats spoke 4 years ago about moving forward and now want to wait. Amy Coney Barrett remains the likely nominee. So Democrats will carry out what I heard reference to today as street theater to excite their base about this issue, but ultimately lack the ability to stop President Trump or the Republicans. What will this street theater look like? Well, expect a lot of heart palpitations about the loss of a great jurist, the repeal of Roe versus Wade, threats to pack the court if Biden gets elected, and the Democrats take the Senate. Additionally, the addition of 2 additional states from Puerto Rico or the District of Columbia to weaken the Senate and acting to remove the Electoral College so that we move from being a republic to a democracy. Of course, we will hear how we need to wait until after the next president is elected to choose the new justice because of 3 reasons. Number 1, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wanted it on her deathbed. If true, and I doubt it, the Constitution doesn't get ignored based on deathbed requests. Number 2, McConnell did this 4 years ago. However, as I pointed out yesterday, McConnell did it while the president was a Democrat and the Senate was a Republican. As I said earlier, both the president and Senate are Republican now. Of course, the actions in both instances met the norms for an appointment in an election year. So the claim is hypocrisy, but this is not a constitutional crisis and not particularly surprising for a politician. Both Republicans and Democrats said things 4 years ago, and they're now taking the opposite position. Or we can look at number 3. The public wants to wait. It's interesting, but not constitutionally controlling as to this particular action. So what's the goal of the conflict? To either convince the Senate to back down on the nominee, hopefully at the last moment, so that President Trump will not have time to move forward with a replacement, or to make the action so unpopular that President Trump and the Senate Republicans cannot get reelected. The Senate Judiciary Committee says there'll be a 3-day hearing. Count upon that hearing time on day 3 to see some disaster that is done to raised by about Trump's nominee and her past that calls for extending the hearing even longer by the Democrats. I predict that the boy cried wolf last time with Justice Kavanaugh, and it makes it unlikely that the Republicans will back down this time with the nomination. Well, what about other threats? Well, first of all, there's the threat that has been presented by Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who has made veiled threats concerning impeachment of both President Trump again and of William Barr. What would be the purpose? The purpose is that impeachment moves to the top of the priority list, and it gives the Democrats an opportunity to try to stall matters to get it past the election. But given that the Senate knows that this is happening and that Mitch McConnell is an expert when it comes to constitutional situations and Senate procedure, I suspect that they will have their guns loaded and ready for this particular problem. How about court packing? What is that? It's a plan to increase the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to a larger number so that Congress can open slots likely to be filled by a new president, a Democrat under this plan. The numbers of increases go from 2 to 6 extra justices. The Supreme Court could actually have additional seats added under the Constitution. The Supreme Court numbers have changed 7 times in the first 80 years of our nation, anywhere from 5 to 10 justices. It went from 10 to 9 in 1865, 155 years ago, when they apparently found the ideal number. On one occasion, the Judicial Procedures Reform Act of 1937 was presented because FDR wanted to pack the court with justices that would agree with him because he kept losing on a 5-4 decision. His solution was add extra justices and make sure he won every time. Despite the fact he had a Democrat House and a Senate, the public rose up against this and the idea was shelved. So now, 83 years later, Democrats think they will try it again. Biden once stood in opposition to court packing, but now has refused to answer whether he would support packing the court. Why? Well, as I pointed out yesterday, he wants to be everything to everyone. But this is constitutionally acceptable. How about adding Puerto Rico and D.C. as states? Again, these are constitutionally acceptable, even though the purpose is to weaken the Senate and its power in Congress. How about abolishing the Electoral College? Well, that one is easier said than done. It would require an amendment to the Constitution which would need the approval of the requisite number of states and would face some serious objection by the smaller states, even some Democratic-led ones, as they would lose their influence in politics, in the national politics. But by the Democratic interpretation of constitutional crisis, these issues are significant. You could see a loss of Second Amendment rights. You could see the creation of judge-made rights that do not exist under congressional laws. And you could see legal restrictions on interpretation of the First Amendment rights as well. What about the filling of the ninth seat of the court? We will see an originalist and constitutionally conservative justice under President Trump if she is appointed. There's one way to protect constitutional rights. Vote in 20 more Republican congressmen and keep President Trump in office. This is Gene Church with the three things.